Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for coming to
Yeah.
talk with me. I'm Eyre, and I'm running for county council member, as you know. And you saw my interview with Civil Beat and had some things to say about my call for somewhat of a repeal of the Jones Act. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Ben. I was raised on Maui. I went to the Maritime Academy right out of high school in California, and I have been working in the maritime industry since 2001.
Awesome.
And I still live here.
Yes. Yeah. And talk to me about the Jones Act. Why do you feel a repeal is not good for Hawaii or for the country?
For one thing, Hawaii is a lower market. It's not a gigantic market. It's very big, but it's not the biggest. So it's not going to draw a lot of attention from the free market. That being said, there's always going to be smaller players. If we were to repeal the Jones Act and anyone could compete, that would come in. But Hawaii is unique in the sense that we have smaller, extremely low profit ports, including Molokai and Lanai. And those are protected by the PUC, which is the Public Utilities Commission, which requires Jones Act cargo or Jones Act boats to bring cargo to those ports on a regular basis. Uniquely now, after COVID, where our cargo dropped off in Kahului as well, if we didn't have protected shipping right now, would Yang Ming Lines or Costco, which is China Overseas Shipping, or any other foreign player, would they want to continue on that if they weren't required? So there are aspects of the Jones Act that, yes, are archaic and maybe don't seem to make a lot of sense, and were developed in a time post-World War I that we didn't have the carrying capacity to support troops overseas. And that was kind of the start of it, was to build up a U.S. fleet and a number of crew of skilled officers and seamen to crew all these ships, that if there was a big sea lift need overseas,
Right.
that it would be available. So it seems like something out of the past that the federal government would have any support for the merchant marine and not just let the free market come in.
Right.
But it also sometimes comes.
Maybe we should talk to just the Jones Act. I'll give a brief overview. The Jones Act is a U.S. act that says that all ships that go between U.S. ports have to be on ships built primarily in the United States and staffed by U.S. citizens. And so it affects...
And owned by U.S. operators.
And owned by U.S. operators. And it mainly affects the non-contiguous states. But it also, you couldn't come into Seattle and drop from China, you couldn't come into Seattle and drop half of your cargo and then take that same ship down to LA, for example.
Correct.
That's because it's been around for 100 years. A lot of those ports just deal with it. This is how things operate. It came on the radar after the last hurricane in Puerto Rico, when they were unable to get a lot of shipments in and out. And they are out in the midst of many other countries in the Caribbean. And so they've been calling for a repeal, which they came to Hawaii as one of the other non-contiguous parts of the U.S. and said, why don't you get on our bandwagon and help us find a repeal? Most people aren't looking for a full repeal, but maybe looking for some parts to be changed. Do you see any room for that? Just maybe some sections that should be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, in cases of emergency, it does make sense to have whatever sea lift that's available come in. Hawaii and Puerto Rico are very different because we don't have a foreign country next to us. I mean, your next stop is going to be Fanning or Christmas. And it's not like a lot of ships are tying them into the run. We always have the ability to have a ship come from China to Honolulu and offload its entirety of cargo, or from Tokyo or Busan or wherever. The benefits to Hawaii are guaranteed cargo. How it works now, if you think of, let's say, Home Depot. Home Depot we think of as a warehouse store, or Costco. They don't actually have warehouses. Their warehouse is the guaranteed shipping run that Matson and Pasha provide. and then to a lesser extent, Young Brothers and Sauce Brothers to go out to the outer islands. So if there's a mistake, say there was the accident that happened on Big Island last week, where a barge loses containers, that is going to extremely disrupt the things on the shelf in the stores, because they don't actually have a back room in Costco.
No.
When you're in Costco, what you see is what you get. There's some stuff stacked high, but for the most part, their logistics is done via ship, and it's just kind of the way things work. So when I used to work for Matson and there was a delay and we are late, Costco is livid, because that means when they're opening on Monday morning,
they don't have it.
The milk isn't there because the milk is still in the reefer on the ship. And if you lose the rigidity of the control of the Jones Act and the PUC, it's not that we can't survive here, it's that that's going to change. Because if you have open market shipping and all of a sudden the small carrier that Costco is contracted with up and folds or changes markets, and they're searching for a new ship.
It's a huge disruption.
Yeah, and it goes back to how, I mean, growing up here, you couldn't go to the store and 100% get what you wanted.
Sure. Yep.
You can now, and we could go back to that and it's fine, but it's just going to be different. Like to keep the convenience, you have to have rigid contracts in shipping because of how our businesses are set up now. It just doesn't quite work to not have that.
What about shipbuilding though? Do you see any room for, I think we're looking, the biggest cost in shipping is the fuel.
Yeah.
Right? So we're looking for ways to be more fuel efficient, more environmentally sensitive. Is there room in the Jones Act to maybe outsource some of our shipbuilding so that can be more affordable and more environmental? I mean, in some ways, when you go outside of the U.S., you're not as environmentally friendly because a lot of the other countries don't have as much, have as many regulations on how things are built. But there are also other places that are very technologically savvy when it comes to shipbuilding and things like that. Do you see any room for outsourcing some of our shipbuilding?
So the funny thing about shipbuilding is, yes, that would be true in some regards. Most of our major shipbuilding has been done recently. So the new ships that just came out from Matson, they're flex fuel ships, so they can burn LNG and they can burn.
So they can burn natural gas and diesel.
Yes.
Right.
But a lot of the major shipbuilders we have in the U.S. now aren't the original ones. It's not, Bath Shipworks in Philadelphia and NASCO. You have Varner shipyards and some of the other names escape me, but they are actually foreign companies that specialize, have set up shop
here,
mainly in the South to avoid unions. But they are coming in. They are trying. The costs are always going to be higher in the U.S. because you have to pay a living wage according to the state, and that's why I think some of the manufacturing auto and ships are going to the South because they have a lower minimum wage.
Right.
However, it's still a minimum wage. And it's still a fair wage, whereas you can't necessarily say that for some of the shipyards overseas. That being said, there have been easements in the past, which when there was a huge buildup during the 80s and the federal government was building warships, there was a need for new container ships, and Sealand, which was the biggest shipper in the world at the time, which is a US-based company, they took advantage of, I shouldn't say take advantage of, but there was no shipyards in the U.S., so they built their ships in Korea and Japan. And those ships are still, many of them are still sailing today. So there are cases where they have been built overseas in the past. And for specialty ships, they've still been done. So the cruise ships, the Pride of America, the keel was laid in Hawaii, and that's what the Jones Act says. It doesn't say the ship has to be built here. The keel has to be laid here.
Oh, interesting.
So once the keel is completed, if you have a specialty ship,
you can send it somewhere else.
The Pride of America was towed to Germany and built in Bremerhaven because that's where they build cruise ships.
Right.
Because they have
I've wondered how cruise ships fit into that too. Yeah.
And cruise ships are very interesting because they're built up as skeletons, and all the rooms are put in as boxes. So the rooms are built in different factories, and they're just slid in
there,
bolted on. But yeah, we do have facilities in the U.S. that can build container ships, and there is competition. The competition is growing because the U.S. container fleet was very old. I've worked on several
And
ships.
so
for
we're kind of
Matson's.
looking right now at this renaissance of shipbuilding.
We're looking at the Renaissance because we're hitting a wall of the steamships still sailing, because it was 2020 that the steamships were going to be phased out and couldn't go to LA anymore. And for a while we had Horizon Lines, which was the precursor to Pasha.
Right.
They were running 4 steamships to the West Coast, and Matson was running at least 2 and sometimes more, because they have ships in deep layup that they'll bring out if one of their active ships has to go to the yard. And they pushed that back to 2022, I believe. So Matson has been actively building new ships.
Because they can't, so just to clear up too, they can't take those older steamships in because they've outlived their useful life, but also because of environmental concerns. Is that right?
I would say more because of environmental concerns. The ships are still sized appropriately for Hawaii. However, the steam plants aren't as efficient. So if we're going back to the fuel is the biggest cost.
Right.
You do want to, if you have the ability and the capital to build new ships, you would like to phase out your inefficient ships.
Right.
And a lot of the ships that get built in the U.S. are built with federal government money through the MSP, which I think is the
Right.
Maritime Security Program.
Subsidy program to
It's
help
a subsidy
shipbuilding.
program. Yeah.
Right.
It's subsidy to make it that companies can apply or fit into the Jones Act and still make money and still go on. And it's a difficult, fine line that they walk, because it's like, how much money do they need? And then if the government gives the Matson or Pasha too much money and they turn these huge profits, that looks bad too. So it's and that's above my pay grade of how much money they get. But I mean, obviously you want more efficient ships running in your ports, and that's why California has been the
kind of the leader in the push in getting
so
the ships more efficient.
They don't want, when you're coming into port, they want you far offshore to switch from bunker C, which is a very low grade, high sulfur fuel.
Right, a lot of pollution. And
then
when you come in, they don't want you dumping all that pollution into their metropolitan area, basically.
Yeah,
right.
And they want ships to be able to switch over to I think they call it the no idle program. So you have to plug into shore power. Mm-hmm. And how those ships function, it's very difficult to shut off a steam turbine.
Steamship,
it's
plug in. Yeah.
If you're only doing a port stay for a day and a half, it takes so long to cool your boiler down, shut it off, warm it back up, and start. It's not like starting a car. It takes
it's like a whole
time.
Day to do that, and then you're only there for a day and a half. So
these modern ships have the ability to come in, shut the engine off, plug shore power in, shut your generators off. So you're running off of the municipal power, which is up to their codes.
Hopefully.
I mean,
I mean, here it's kind of, we're burning diesel on shore, or we're burning diesel on the ship, so we don't really see a change in efficiency. But Los Angeles has made some changes there. So what do you see? I can tell you're very excited about the future of the maritime industry. Like, it sounds like they're on a shift.
Yeah.
Right? How do you see here in our county, how do you see us kind of keeping up with this renaissance and this push towards kind of a cleaner, hopefully more efficient age? Like, what could we do here that would help us and reduce shipping costs, but also be more environmentally conscious and take care of our workers that are in this industry?
I mean, shipping costs are reduced by economies of scale, unfortunately. If Maui continues to grow and we can cut Honolulu out of the package, that would reduce shipping costs if you could have direct traffic to Maui. But as it stands now, it doesn't seem, according to what the shippers are doing, it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to bring a whole container ship into Maui and do a whole offload. No. Even though Pasha guys are doing it, Pasha does bring a ship every other week, sometimes every week in here, but they're doing...
From the continent.
They go, typically, so Pasha operates 2 roll-on, roll-off. Well, one is a roll-on, roll-off exclusively, which means cars roll on, cars roll off, and it's all done via ramp. They have the Jean Ann, which does all chassis cars, and then they have the Marjorie C, which is a Rokon, which means it has containers in the front, which are loaded and unloaded by a gantry crane, and then has cars in the back. They're only doing cars and chassis, so containers on chassis, the Kahului. But if Kahului is a big enough draw, you could have a direct line from the West Coast that didn't involve Honolulu.
Right.
So as Maui continues to grow, that will probably happen. There will probably be a direct run if they could justify an entire container ship.
Right. And it may not be incredibly frequently. It might just be...
Yeah, like I would probably start out once every 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's then that falls down to perishables. So that's why we have the barge traffic. So we pre-COVID-19 we had 3 Young Brothers barge, sometimes 4 a week coming to Kahului, and that's how you get your ice cream.
Right.
It's like because some stuff doesn't keep well.
Right.
And some stuff's hard to transport.
It's kind of our dairy, all of our dairy and
yeah, fresh produce comes from
and
mainland
all the
things
produce.
like that.
Yeah.
And in terms of there's all these studies that say that repealing the Jones Act will, save us 10 cents on the dollar. They're unproven. I mean, because yeah, you could have an immediate carrier come in, pick up the Hawaii cargo, and do it for a while, and then see like, this isn't turning out well. I would rather carry, do the Tokyo to Vancouver run,
right,
and start doing that instead.
Right.
So then you could be stuck with the fact that it's an unprofitable market. So to get someone to do it, they're going to raise their shipping rates too. And in the open market, there's no control. So I mean, I'm not an expert in it. It could be cheaper, it could be more expensive, and you wouldn't know until you repealed it.
Until you did it. Right.
Yeah. So it's my biggest pushback against the repeal of the Jones Act, being a merchant mariner for a long time, is I've seen what it looks like working on the open seas. I would rather, as opposed to have a repeal of the Jones Act, have some oversight in international shipping.
Oh, interesting.
Because they work, not all foreign ships are terrible. They're good foreign ships too. And there's great officers, there's great sailors, there's great engineers who work on the foreign ships. But typically they're paid far less than we're paid in the US. And the pay we make in the US, I don't feel we're overpaid. It used to be a great job. When I started out, most of the older captains I worked with, they owned coffee plantations on the Big Island, or they had houses on the beach in Diamond Head,
Right.
or they lived in the North Shore of Oahu and had a cool house right on Sunset Beach. All my contemporaries who sail now, have small houses in tight neighborhoods in Hawaii, and they're sailing, captain for Matson or captain for Young Brothers, and it's just not really. Yeah, it's a good job. It's a great job. Like I work as a captain, and it's a great job, and I can support my family here. But you're not. You
don't see it as this incredibly lucrative career. It's
No,
a great job, but it's not something where
we're not fleecing the people making all this money.
Right.
Like at best, we're getting by, and often you're watching the people who've come after us to Hawaii go right past us. So most of the guys I work with, especially Young Brothers, like they are people from here.
Yeah.
And they almost all live here.
Right.
And most of them support their family here. I mean, there are people who live on the mainland, but it's a minority. And the same goes for Matson. Matson is different in the fact that because it's a West Coast Hawaii company, there's a lot of guys from all over the mainland, but all that money goes back into the economy. And there are studies, I couldn't quote them, but that show for every merchant marine job, how many other jobs are supported by that, because it does support a community that supports, like the community of sailors who work in Hawaii support the community here.
Right. It's kind of this quiet group, though. I mean, you don't hear a lot about the merchant marines here in Hawaii.
An anecdote: the ships have to go through a registration society to be, or classification society. So you have the Coast Guard, which is our nation state, which oversees safety.
Right.
But you also register yourself with the American Bureau of Shipping or Det Norske Veritas, and that's your insurer. And your insurer also does inspections. And I was talking to one of the guys who worked for ABS, American Bureau of Shipping, in LA, and he was an Indian captain, like sailed in the Indian fleet for like 20 years. And he told me not once in his career did he ever work on a ship with the same person. After about 2 years in the U.S. fleet,
Wow.
I have never gotten on a ship where I didn't know someone who worked on there.
That's
And it's a decent sized industry, but it's very small. I know someone on every ship that comes to Hawaii.
That's great.
And that's after, not even 20 years of doing it. So my fear is the fact that if you were to bring in a foreign workforce, you're basically inviting unfair labor practices to our shore.
Right.
And especially it's not that the ships don't come in from overseas. They do all the time. We have a gas ship that comes every month here. We have several foreign flag ships a day going to Oahu. But then you're just inviting them to have below minimum wage workers working, carrying our cargo.
Back and forth.
Back
and forth between LA and here.
Yeah.
Right. But you do see some room maybe in the shipbuilding area. I mean, I think that's what most of the proponents for repeal of the Jones Act in Hawaii are looking for, ways to decrease the cost of ships. And so without decreasing the quality. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what has had that push. I think Puerto Rico is pushing for a different reason.
Yeah.
But I think that for Hawaii, we recognize that we are able to take care of our workers better through the Jones Act. We're able to make sure that there's, that all of these regulations that are good for the shipping industry are there. It's positive for us. But I do think they're looking at how can we just kind of mitigate some of the costs. And so they're kind of looking towards the shipbuilding. Mm-hmm. But as you said, I mean, from my understanding, it was because especially Europe that has a huge shipping industry, especially with cars back and forth between Europe, right, and the US, and that Rotterdam to New York line is very well trafficked. Mm-hmm. And they have they're very well subsidized there also. And so they've been able to make these technological improvements with adding natural gas and changing ship design and things like that. But as you said, that we're finally getting that here in the US also. So maybe it's not quite as pressing as it was. And maybe they need to look at just giving more exemptions when you have natural disasters or
absolutely
or things like that, or look at Puerto Rico and give them some sort of
I don't think in any way if there was a hurricane that devastated Maui,
right, that
we should say that, well, there's no Matson ship and the barges are all busy, that the 5 foreign ships who happen to be tied up in Honolulu shouldn't come here.
Right.
That should always be a thing that's available.
So maybe somewhere in that partial repeal, it would say giving a quicker leeway during times of emergency or shipping disruption or whatever it is.
Yeah, and also to touch on the fact that building overseas, we all love the convenience and the low cost of getting our stuff from overseas, but you have the same problem, as getting your iPhone from China, from a factory over there, is the labor practices of a foreign shipyard are different than the labor practices of a U.S. shipyard.
And so we're continuing to support the industries that don't take care of the human component.
So it's, you save 5 cents on your gallon of milk, but then at what cost does it come to another human somewhere else in the world?
Right.
And I mean, I don't know if I'm the person to say that we should pay more for that, but it is something that always goes through my mind when I see some study put out by, the major opponents of the Jones Act federally, which are the Federalist Society and the Cato Institute, which are these huge libertarian think tanks, which are, funded by the Koch brothers. That's their big thing they put out is the cost, but there's also the reality of the world too.
Right.
And the real thing you can do here to cut the costs is something that I would never hope for, which is make Maui bigger.
Yeah.
Because the biggest way to improve costs in shipping is economies of scale.
Right.
Because it started with the biggest ships in the world that were containerized ships were 300 to 500 feet, and now they're running 1,500 foot ships. And I felt that I was on a big Matson ship, and then we pull into Shanghai, and we're this little rinky-dink,
tiny little thing,
600 foot ship that you're next to these monsters.
Right. Well, and that's something too. I mean, we don't have the harbor for anything bigger than what we're already doing, right? I mean,
the harbors weren't designed for it, but they figured it out. So they said years ago, I've heard anecdotally that the biggest ship to go into the Willy Willy on Kauai was going to be about 700 feet. And we've pulled like 1,100 foot cruise ships in there.
But as far as Maui goes, we're not equipped to be a big harbor, right? Without a major infrastructure overhaul.
There's a master plan to expand the harbor. We have the capacity to carry bigger ships. Not the biggest ships in the world. We're kind of constrained by draft.
Right.
But
that's how much water or how much space we need between the surface of the water and
yeah. And then also our yards are small. So the state does have a master plan. They're expanding the harbor. You'll see around Kahului. They've acquired land around the harbor in Kahului, and they're pushing out because you have to stack the containers. There has to be a physical place to put them.
Right.
So that is all addressed in the master plan. And that could be a way to improve efficiency too, is to, as opposed to, running barges to run ships. However, one of the problems in Kahului also is the wind. So when they did have a gantry crane here, they wouldn't operate at over 30 knots of wind.
Which is every day after 1 p.m. So
that's why we're still running the barges and the
right. So we're missing out on some efficiency that could happen right in Kahului. That there's options for making it more efficient to offload, and hopefully the expansion will address that. You're getting a little smile, which makes me think that there's some
I don't know the right answer to it. It's there's probably restructuring that could be done at Young Brothers to make it more efficient, but they've been doing it for a long time, and I don't know if I'm the right person to say that.
But maybe just the infrastructure switch it. I mean, there's some infrastructure change that could happen.
Yes.
And with the new master plan, hopefully that'll address some of those issues, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, this all comes to a really good point, which is I think a lot of times we get so concerned about the shipping costs, and really we need to look at how on island we're producing for ourselves.
Yeah, totally.
Because shipping becomes much less of an issue if we're producing most of our food, especially here. And that's something that we can all look to do better and not be so concerned about the shipping costs. And same with fuel. I mean, fuel's a big part of it too, that we get so concerned about our fuel coming in. And that's, we're shipping that fuel from across the ocean. So
it does come in. And we have only 2 providers of fuel on the island. So you have HFN and PAR. And so you're limited there. And I don't know why we have higher fuel costs on Maui than we do on the Big Islands, or they do on Kauai. If you look at that state thing they put on the news every night, we're always the highest. Well, except for Maui County. We can't include Molokai and Lanai because they always have us beat. But so we don't, if you're getting stuff brought into Hawaii, we don't live in an efficient place to have cheap stuff.
Right.
We are the most isolated islands in the world.
Right.
We're in the middle of nowhere, so it's got to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, because we're a smaller market, people aren't bringing big container ships as often straight from China loaded, because they have to go through a giant port in LA where everything that comes from Ningbo and Shanghai and Xiamen,
divided up,
it all gets sorted.
Right.
And it's just like your Amazon cart when you, not everything you order.
It's coming from all over the place.
Yeah.
Coming to one area, put in one box, and then shipped over again, which is...
I don't ever see it being cheap to live here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there are thinkers who can make it cheaper, but there's also, I would say you want to be as cheap as possible while also being as ethical as possible. So it's, you don't want to needlessly spend more money for your shipping, but you also don't want to open the floodgates and have someone delivering your food door to door, island to island, who is not making enough money to even go ashore in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of equated it to like the people who are proponents of repealing the labor aspect of the Jones Act in Hawaii is, well, why would you stop there? Construction's expensive too with labor. Why not have all foreign workers do the construction?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
And you have to draw the line somewhere. I selfishly have always drawn the line around the Jones Act to protect my job, but
I do think, just looking into the research, I do think most people are looking at just the ships themselves. But as you said, you're right there at the forefront of this industry, and you're seeing what's coming out. And I think a lot of the people that are looking at it are looking from like a small business perspective, or even an agricultural perspective, and looking at how we ship our goods. If agriculture sees a new renaissance and we have enough food that we can ship it off, they're looking at how can we get them to the markets in Southeast Asia or Australia at a lower cost. And so I think that's why they were looking at how can we reduce the cost? How can we have our goods picked up here and taken overseas more quickly without
I've often
having
heard that used as, well, overseas more quickly is fine.
Yeah.
Ship them overseas.
Yeah.
That's go straight overseas. Anyone
just
can do that.
Just have something out of Honolulu that just goes right now, right?
Well, the big argument's always been, the big ranches on Big Island. It's a drag how cattle gets moved. Right. They are brought to the harbor. They're put in what they call affectionately cowtainers, which are containers that they store all the cattle in. They are shipped to Oahu, put on a matching ship, shipped to the West Coast through LA, and put in stockyards.
Right.
That's a lot of stress on the animal. You want the least amount of moves as possible.
Right.
So one of the previous arguments that was put out by, politicians in the past, well, we want a livestock carrier, which do exist. There are ships that carry just livestock to come into the Big Island and go straight to the West Coast. I don't know if they have the head,
the amount of cattle,
of animals to actually support that.
Right.
So I don't know if that argument has any basis in reality, because there are no U.S. flagged livestock carriers. There's only a handful in the world,
right.
And they're typically used to carry sheep to the Middle East and things like that. It's
right.
But yeah, that is an argument for farmers. However, that being said, I have always thought that the less than container load cargo that goes inter-island seems ridiculous, because you can pull into Kahului with your truck and offload a basket of papaya and ship it to Oahu. And I've always thought that's inefficient and it slows the harbor down. However, when I was leaving work the other day, I work in Kahului Harbor, and I saw a farmer coming in with a truck full of cabbage that's shipping to market in Honolulu. How else would they do that efficiently? And that's
because they would have to fill an entire container in order to ship it.
They would have to go to a freight forwarder offsite.
Right.
They would have to wait until the container is completely filled. Then that container gets taken to the harbor, gets put on a barge, shipped to Oahu, gets taken to a freight forwarder, gets unpacked, and then gets put on trucks and goes. So that farmer can pull in, put his pallet down, it goes on the barge that night, his counterpart picks it up the next day, puts it on his truck, straight to market.
Right.
Doesn't make Young Brothers a lot of money, but it's protected by the PUC.
That's a really great point. It's a really great point.
It's sometimes you spend a little bit more money to get quality. It's like when you're buying your tools, like, do I get the cheapest one or do I get the Snap-on? And it's not a perfect analogy, but it kind of is. Like, you got to spend a little bit more money to get the convenience sometimes, and that's what some of the extra costs in Hawaii can represent.
No, that is a great summary, and I appreciate you are so knowledgeable in all of these things. And I'm running for county council member, and these are not things that the county deals with.
Yeah.
But the county can push for things both on a state level and a national level that benefit us. And so that's why I was looking at the Jones Act, but you've definitely changed my mind on a lot of most of the aspects on it. So I appreciate you coming in and talking about that.
Yeah, of course.
And I think everyone would agree that we want to keep our labor, well supported. We want to make sure that we are being ethical and environmental in the things that we do when it comes to shipping and all aspects, really.
Yeah.
And really, we just need to push for more local growing, more local agriculture, more local manufacturing, and so that we rely less on shipping, because it sounds like even with the Jones Act, even if for some reason the Jones Act was changed, we aren't looking at a shipping cost decrease in the near future.
No.
So
the best case scenario is, like you said, to focus more local, because that's the only way to really eliminate this huge global shipping market. Is if we're bringing everything in, there's always going to be shipping costs. And we're so dependent on the cost of fuel, which anyone who ships mats in regular knows. The fuel surcharge that you see on your bill, it's when that price of oil goes up, what you pay goes up. Because at the end of a voyage, you can look at on a Matson ship, you do the whole round, you go to China, you come back to LA, and you look at what it costs to bunker, which means to fuel the ship, compared to what you look at what the labor costs, and it's way different. And since you can't control the cost of fuel, the people who bear the brunt are the labor.
So they'll decrease the cost of labor, which is not helping.
Contractually, they can't typically do
No,
it, but they do control the food budget. They do control other things. So there are things that go down that the work feels, and there have been times through the union where we take concessions to get lower pay to keep our jobs.
Right.
Because, like I said, there's
because
no
the
control.
fuel increases.
So if fuel does skyrocket again, shipping will increase.
So this is another call. We just need to eat more that can be grown or made here.
Yep.
And all those other things. Buy your clothing used.
There we go.
Whatever doesn't need to be shipped in. But is there anything else? I appreciate you coming in and speaking to me so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for listening.